303 billion barrels. The largest proven oil reserves on the planet lie beneath Venezuelan soil. Not in Saudi Arabia, not in Russia, not anywhere else. Venezuela commands 17% of the world's known oil, concentrated in the Orinoco Belt, where deposits run so deep and so vast that extraction teams could drill for a century and barely scratch the surface. Yet this nation of 30 million people exports less than 1% of global supply. Its refineries stand silent. Its pipelines corrode. Its state oil company bleeds technical expertise and operational capacity with each passing year. This is not an accident of geography or a quirk of geology. This is the culmination of a geopolitical calculation that has been unfolding across multiple presidential administrations, through shifting ideological frameworks, beneath the surface of diplomatic niceties and economic sanctions. The wealth exists, the infrastructure exists, the global demand exists. What has been systematically dismantled is Venezuela's ability to access, control, and profit from the single largest energy resource in the Western Hemisphere. And that dismantling follows a pattern older than anyone currently alive. The arithmetic is brutally simple. Venezuela possesses more proven reserves than Saudi Arabia's 267 billion barrels, more than Canada's 170 billion, more than Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates combined. The Orinoco Belt alone contains deposits that dwarf most nations' entire energy portfolios. But proven reserves mean nothing without the capacity to extract, refine, and transport. And capacity requires three things: capital, technology, and political stability. Since the early 2000s, Venezuela has been systematically deprived of all three. Under Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan government nationalized key sectors of the oil industry, a move that sent shockwaves through international energy markets and triggered a realignment of global petroleum politics. The rhetoric was anti-imperialist. The policy was resource sovereignty. The result was predictable. Foreign companies withdrew expertise. International credit dried up. The skilled workforce began its exodus. By the time Nicolás Maduro inherited power in 2013, PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, was already hemorrhaging the technical knowledge required to maintain production at anything approaching historical levels. The company that once employed the world's most sophisticated engineers and geologists became a hollowed bureaucracy, its ranks purged of dissent, its operations crippled by political loyalty tests and corruption. This collapse did not happen in isolation. It happened under the watchful eye of an international sanctions regime, designed specifically to choke Venezuela's revenue streams. The United States imposed sectoral sanctions in 2017, targeting the oil industry directly. In 2019, those sanctions expanded to freeze Venezuelan government assets and prohibit transactions with PDVSA. By 2025, the architecture of financial isolation was complete. Venezuela could not access international banking systems. It could not secure letters of credit. It could not purchase spare parts or technical equipment through conventional channels. Every transaction became a criminal exposure. Every financial relationship became a liability. The effect was surgical. Venezuelan oil production, which peaked above 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s, collapsed to roughly 700,000 barrels per day by 2020. The decline continued. By late 2025, production hovered around 600,000 barrels daily, a catastrophic contraction that removed one of the world's major oil producers from functioning global markets. But this was not about punishment for ideological deviation. This was about creating the conditions for eventual control. Because heavy crude is not like the light, sweet oil that flows easily from Saudi fields. Venezuelan oil requires specialized refining infrastructure. It must be mixed with lighter grades or processed through complex cracking units. Only certain refineries can handle it. Refineries in the United States, specifically on the Gulf Coast, were designed explicitly to process heavy Venezuelan crude. Chevron operates in Venezuela not out of charity, but because its refineries in Louisiana and Texas depend on that heavy feedstock. When sanctions were selectively lifted to allow Chevron limited operations in late 2022, the message was clear. American companies would remain positioned to control the processing and distribution of Venezuelan oil, even as Venezuela itself was denied the ability to develop independent refining capacity. This is where historical patterns become impossible to ignore. Venezuela has been the trigger for American interventionism in the Caribbean basin repeatedly over the past century and a quarter. In 1895, when a border dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana threatened to expand European influence in South America, the United States invoked the Monroe Doctrine for the first time as justification for direct involvement in Latin American affairs. Secretary of State Richard Olney demanded that Britain submit to arbitration, declaring that the United States is practically sovereign on this continent. Britain backed down. Venezuela's sovereignty became secondary to American hemispheric dominance. 7 years later, in 1902, when Venezuela refused to pay its foreign debts, Britain, Germany, and Italy imposed a naval blockade. They bombarded Venezuelan ports. They seized customs houses. President Theodore Roosevelt, initially neutral, watched European powers enforce debt collection through military force in America's sphere of influence. The episode directly led to the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904, which asserted the right of the United States to intervene in Latin American nations to stabilize economic affairs and prevent European intervention. The precedent was established. Venezuela's internal crises would be managed by external powers, and the United States reserved the right to determine which external powers those would be. Fast forward to the Cold War. In 1958, a civil military coup overthrew the Pérez-Jiménez dictatorship. The United States initially supported the dictator. He had received the Legion of Merit Award from President Eisenhower for his services to foreign capital. When he fell, Washington quickly pivoted, embracing the succeeding government of Romulo Betancourt as a model democratic alternative to Cuba's communist revolution. Betancourt became the acceptable face of Latin American governance, anti-communist, pro-business, and willing to repress leftist movements while maintaining a democratic facade. Venezuela was held up as proof that American-aligned capitalism could coexist with electoral politics in the developing world. But the model was always fragile. It depended on oil revenue flowing upward to sustain a patronage system that kept Venezuelan society stable enough to prevent revolutionary upheaval. When oil prices collapsed in the 1980s and 1990s, that system began to crack. Austerity riots erupted in 1989. The military attempted coups in 1992. By the time Chavez won the presidency in 1998, Venezuela's political establishment had lost legitimacy. His Bolivarian revolution was a direct response to decades of structural inequality sustained by oil wealth concentrated in elite hands, and his decision to assert state control over that wealth set him on a collision course with the United States. The pattern repeats. Venezuela asserts sovereignty over its resources. External powers respond with economic pressure. Internal stability collapses. Intervention becomes inevitable. But this time, the intervention is not about preventing European powers from seizing territory. It is about ensuring that the largest oil reserves on Earth do not fall under the control of American adversaries, because China and Russia saw the same opportunity. Between 2007 and 2020, China loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, secured against future oil shipments. Those loans kept the Maduro government solvent when Western credit vanished. In return, Venezuela sends roughly 80% of its current oil exports to China, feeding the world's largest importer of crude. Russia provided military equipment, technical advisors, and diplomatic cover at the United Nations. In 2018, Russian strategic bombers landed in Venezuela in a direct demonstration of military reach into the Western Hemisphere. Joint naval exercises followed. In 2022, Russia and Venezuela signed agreements on energy cooperation and military technical collaboration. Iran joined the network, providing drone technology and asymmetric warfare capabilities. This is the geopolitical nightmare that American strategists have spent 2 decades trying to prevent. A hostile power establishing an energy foothold in the Western Hemisphere, using Venezuelan oil as a bridgehead for broader influence. It is the Monroe Doctrine's central anxiety made real in the 21st century. Not European colonialism, but Eurasian great power competition, playing out in America's traditional sphere of dominance. And the United States has responded with the same playbook it has used for a century: economic strangulation, diplomatic isolation, and the slow construction of a rationale for direct intervention. The recent military operation to capture Maduro represents the culmination of this logic. It was not a humanitarian intervention. It was not a defense of democracy. It was the application of leadership decapitation doctrine to remove a geopolitical obstacle. The operation relied on overwhelming technological superiority, cyber attacks, disabled air defenses, precision strikes, neutralized command and control infrastructure, and elite special operations forces extracted the target before coherent resistance could organize. The message sent to Beijing and Moscow was unmistakable. American military power can penetrate even fortified capitals when the political will exists. But the operation solved nothing. Removing Maduro does not rebuild Venezuela's oil industry. It does not restore the skilled workforce that fled over the past 2 decades. It does not repair decades of deferred maintenance on pipelines, refineries, and extraction equipment. It does not resolve the political divisions within Venezuelan society. What it does is create a power vacuum in a country sitting on 300 billion barrels of oil, with no clear succession plan, no functional state institutions, and multiple foreign powers holding competing claims to influence. The interim government under Vice President Delcy Rodriguez exists at American sufferance. She was not elected. She was not appointed through any constitutional process. She is a placeholder. But a placeholder for what? President Trump announced that the United States would run the country until a safe, proper, and judicious transition could be arranged. The language is almost identical to the pronouncements made during the occupations of Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua in the early 20th century. The United States does not annex territories anymore. It establishes protectorates. It installs compliant governments. It secures long-term access to strategic resources while avoiding the political liabilities of formal colonialism. This is where the historical echoes become most unsettling. Every previous American intervention in Latin America has been justified on temporary grounds. Restore order, protect democracy, fight communism, combat drug trafficking. The justifications change with each generation, but the pattern remains constant. Assert control, extract resources, maintain dominance. and every intervention has produced consequences that outlasted the original rationale. The occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934 left behind a legacy of political instability that persists today. The CIA-backed coup in Guatemala in 1954 led to decades of civil war. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 cemented Castro's hold on power for half a century. The invasion of Panama in 1989 removed Manuel Noriega, but did nothing to address the structural conditions that had enabled his rise. Venezuela is already showing signs of following this pattern. The power-sharing arrangement in Caracas is fragile. Diosdado Cabello controls the Interior Ministry. Vladimir Padrino Lopez commands the armed forces. Jorge Rodriguez presides over the National Assembly. These are not democratic reformers. These are regime insiders who have calculated that collaboration with Washington offers better survival prospects than resistance. But their control depends entirely on American military backing. The moment that backing wavers, the arrangement collapses. And American backing will waver, because the political will required to sustain a long-term occupation of Venezuela does not exist. The American public has no appetite for another prolonged military commitment in the developing world. The budgetary costs are unsustainable. The diplomatic blowback from Latin American governments is already mounting. Brazil condemned the operation. Mexico recalled its ambassador. Cuba mobilized its military and declared 2 days of national mourning for the 32 Cuban personnel killed during the raid. Colombia's president publicly criticized the violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. The Organization of American States is paralyzed by division. Meanwhile, China and Russia are not withdrawing. They are recalibrating. Beijing issued statements condemning American violations of international law while signaling privately that it would continue energy cooperation with whatever government emerges in Caracas. Russia dispatched additional military advisors to assess the situation. Iran offered technical assistance to rebuild damaged infrastructure. These powers understand that the struggle for influence in Venezuela is measured in decades, not months. They can afford to wait, they can afford to invest, and they know that American attention will eventually shift to other crises. So the most dangerous phase is not the military operation that removed Maduro. That was the easy part. The dangerous phase is what comes next. The slow unraveling of American control. The internal power struggles within Venezuela's fractured political elite. The potential for civil conflict between factions aligned with different external sponsors, and the growing realization that 300 billion barrels of oil cannot be secured through military force alone. They require political legitimacy, economic investment, and social stability, none of which the current arrangement provides. The United States won't let Venezuela's oil wealth slip away because it cannot afford to. Not in a world where energy security determines great power competition. Not when China and Russia are actively challenging American dominance in multiple theaters. Not when the Monroe Doctrine has been revived as the organizing principle of American foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. But winning a single military operation is not the same as winning control over a nation's future. And history suggests that the harder the United States grips, the more likely Venezuela is to fracture entirely. The oil is still there, the reserves haven't changed, but the path to extracting, refining, and profiting from those reserves grows more complex with each passing day. Because the operation that removed Maduro may have achieved its tactical objectives, but it has opened strategic questions that no amount of military superiority can answer. Who governs Venezuela? On whose authority? For whose benefit? And what happens when the inevitable power struggles begin? when the factions turn on each other, when the interim arrangement becomes untenable, the United States has asserted control. Now it must figure out what to do with it. And in the meantime, the largest oil reserves on the planet sit beneath a country with no legitimate government, no functioning institutions, and multiple foreign powers waiting to see who blinks first. The real struggle for Venezuela's oil wealth hasn't ended. It has only just begun. And this time, there is no clear exit strategy, no obvious endpoint, and no guarantee that American power will be sufficient to impose a lasting solution. The wealth beneath Venezuelan soil is not slipping away. It is being fought over in ways that make extraction nearly impossible. And that may be the most dangerous outcome of all, an energy prize so vast that no single power can afford to lose it, but so contested that no one can actually claim it. That is the logic that will define the next decade in Venezuela. Not liberation, not democracy, not development, just the grinding calculus of who controls the oil and what they are willing to sacrifice to keep it from their rivals. The operation was clean. The consequences will be anything but.